Imagine this. A man spends his whole life chasing after wealth. He works tirelessly, buys the grand house, drives the luxury car, collects all the shiny possessions that promise happiness. For a moment he feels satisfied. But late at night, when the noise of the world quiets down, he lies awake, restless, wondering, why does it still feel like something is missing? This story isn't just his. It's the story of almost every human being. We live in a world that constantly whispers, happiness is out there. Earn more, own more, show more, and then you'll finally be complete. And so we run. We run through life like thirsty travelers chasing a mirage in the desert, thinking the next achievement, the next purchase, the next milestone will quench the thirst inside. But when we finally arrive, the water disappears. The joy slips through our fingers like sand. Why is it that no matter how much we receive, the feeling of fulfillment fades so quickly? Why is happiness always just one step further, never quite within reach? The Buddha understood this thousands of years ago. He saw clearly that joy built upon possession is fragile, like building a home on sand. The moment the tide comes in, it washes everything away. Our possessions, our titles, our fleeting pleasures, none of them can provide the lasting happiness we crave. They come and go, and with them, so does our fragile sense of satisfaction. But there is another way. A hidden secret so simple, so powerful that it almost sounds too easy. True joy does not come from what we receive, but from what we give. Think about the last time you helped someone, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Maybe it was something small, giving up your seat on a crowded bus, offering a listening ear to a friend in pain, or donating quietly to someone in need. Do you remember the feeling that blossomed in your chest? That warm, light, unexplainable joy. That is the secret we so often overlook. Giving flips the story of happiness on its head. It turns the focus away from endless taking and shines a light on something deeper, something freer. Because when you give, you stop clinging. You stop grasping. You stop measuring your worth by what you own. Instead, you discover that happiness is not about accumulation, but about connection. Not about possession, but about compassion. And here's the profound truth. When you give, you are not actually losing anything. You are expanding. Expanding your heart, expanding your joy, expanding the circle of kindness in this world. Giving is not subtraction, it's multiplication. It multiplies happiness not just for the receiver, but for the giver as well. The Buddha called this dana, the practice of generosity, and he placed it at the very foundation of the spiritual path because he knew a heart that cannot give is a heart trapped by greed, but a heart that gives is a heart already tasting liberation. Yet, in our modern world, we often mistake giving as an obligation, a burden, or even a sign of weakness. We ask, what do I get in return? But that question itself blinds us to the treasure. The true return of giving is joy, deep, lasting, unshakable joy. Picture this, a candle lights another candle. Does the first candle lose anything? No. In fact, the light doubles, triples, spreads. That is what generosity does. It takes the flame within you and spreads it outward, until the darkness around you is filled with light. And so, as we begin this journey, let us pause and ask, what if happiness has never been about how much we can take, but about how much we can give? What if the secret to a joyful life has been within our hands all along, not in clenching tighter, but in letting go? The world may not teach us this truth, but the heart feels it. Deep down, we know that the moments we gave freely were the moments we felt most alive. And as we walk further, we will begin to see clearly why the endless chase for possessions keeps us restless, and how giving becomes the doorway to freedom. We grow up in a world that tells us a single story. Happiness can be bought, earned, or owned. From the moment we are children, advertisements, culture, even the people around us reinforce this belief. We are told, get good grades so you can get into a good school. Get into a good school so you can get a good job. Get a good job so you can make good money. Make good money so you can buy the good life. It sounds convincing, doesn't it? Because yes, possessions can bring comfort. A warm home protects us from the cold. Food fills our stomachs. A safe car takes us where we need to go. These things matter, but here is the trap. We mistake comfort for happiness, and in doing so we chase endlessly, thinking the next possession will finally deliver the joy we seek. Yet the joy fades, always. Think about the last time you bought something you truly desired. Maybe it was a brand new phone, a piece of clothing, or even that dream vacation. At first there was excitement, the thrill of unboxing, the rush of having something new. But how long did that feeling last? A day, a week, a month? Slowly, the excitement vanished, and soon you were searching again for the next thing. This is the cycle of craving. The Buddha called it tanha, the thirst, the unquenchable desire that keeps us restless. He saw that desire is endless, like drinking salty water to satisfy thirst. The more we consume, the thirstier we become. Possessions whisper promises. Own me and you'll finally be complete. But they lie, because what we truly crave is not the object itself. It is the feeling we think the object will bring, and feelings by their nature are impermanent. They rise, they fall, they vanish. Clinging to them is like trying to hold onto a rainbow. Even the wealthiest among us are not immune. History is full of kings, emperors, and billionaires who owned entire empires, yet felt a gnawing emptiness inside. They had everything the world said would bring happiness, and still they asked, "Why do I feel so unfulfilled?" Here's the truth. Possessions can fill our hands, but never our hearts. The Buddha often used simple stories to reveal this. One story tells of a man who collected treasures, filling his house with gold and jewels. But every night he lay awake, fearful that thieves would come. His possessions brought him no peace, only anxiety. Another man, who gave freely to others, slept soundly, with nothing to guard but a peaceful heart. Which life would you choose? Our modern lives are not so different. The more we own, the more we worry about protecting it, upgrading it, comparing it. The joy of possession is fragile, dependent on circumstances, always under threat of loss. And loss, the Buddha reminds us, is inevitable. Everything we cling to will one day slip away, whether by change, by accident, or by death itself. But here is the paradox. The very thing we think will bring happiness, possessing more, is often what keeps us trapped in restlessness. The house gets bigger, but so do the bills. The car gets shinier, but so does the envy of others. The closet gets fuller, but so does the dissatisfaction inside. So what is the alternative? The Buddha's wisdom points us gently in another direction. Instead of asking, "What more can I take?" ask, "What more can I give?" Because while possessions lose their shine, generosity never does. The joy of giving doesn't fade with time. In fact, it deepens, leaving a quiet, lasting warmth in the heart. And here lies the great illusion revealed. Happiness was never hidden in the things we owned. It was waiting in the act of letting go. If possessions cannot give us lasting happiness, then where does joy truly lie? The answer may surprise us, because it is not hidden in getting more, but in letting go, through the simple, powerful act of giving. Think for a moment about a time you gave freely. Maybe you helped a stranger carry heavy bags. Maybe you donated to someone in need. Or maybe you simply offered a smile on a day when someone's world felt heavy. Do you remember what you felt inside? It wasn't the anxious craving of possession. It wasn't the fragile rush of newness. It was different, it was lighter, it was warm, expansive, and deeply human. This is the joy of giving, a joy that does not depend on conditions, on wealth, or on circumstance, a joy available to anyone at any moment. The Buddha understood this and placed ** generosity, dana, ** as the very first perfection on the path to awakening. Why? Because giving heals, not just the receiver but the giver as well. When we give, something profound happens inside us. The tight grip of greed begins to loosen. The walls of the ego soften. The constant whisper of me, mine, my grows quiet. In its place, the heart opens. And in that opening, we taste freedom. Modern science, in its own language, confirms what the Buddha taught centuries ago. Neuroscientists have found that when we give, our brains release chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, the very same chemicals that create feelings of joy, trust, and connection. Psychologists call it the helper's high. It's as if the human brain was wired to find happiness not in taking but in giving. But this joy is more than biology. It touches the spirit. Because every act of giving, no matter how small, is a reminder of our interconnection. We realize, I am not separate from you. Your suffering touches me, and my kindness can touch you. In that moment, the illusion of separation begins to dissolve, and what shines forth is compassion, the very heart of Buddhism. There is an old saying, when one candle lights another, the first candle loses nothing, yet the light in the world doubles. This is the beauty of giving. You don't become smaller by sharing, you become larger. You don't empty your heart by offering love. You expand it beyond measure. And what about those who receive? To someone hungry, a meal may be life itself. To someone lonely, a kind word may be salvation. But to the giver, the act plants seeds of joy that continue to bloom long after the moment has passed. This is the law of karma in its most radiant form. The energy of generosity returns, not always in material ways, but in the peace, warmth, and meaning that fills the giver's life. Think of it this way. Greed is a closed fist, tight, rigid, always afraid of losing. Giving is an open palm, soft, fearless, ready to share. Which hand feels lighter? Which heart feels freer? When we give, we don't just heal others, we heal ourselves. We heal the endless craving that keeps us restless. We heal the loneliness that comes from isolation. We heal the illusion that joy must be hunted, chased, or bought. Instead, joy arises naturally like a spring bubbling from the earth, needing no effort, no price, no conditions. And so, perhaps the question is not, can I afford to give? But can I afford not to? For every act of giving is an act of freedom, a release from the prison of self-centered desire. Every act of giving makes the heart lighter, the spirit brighter, the world gentler. In a world that constantly teaches us to take, the courage to give is a revolution. And it is through this revolution of the heart that we begin to discover a happiness that cannot be stolen, cannot be lost, and cannot be broken. Giving is not one single act. It is a path, a gradual opening of the heart. The Buddha taught that generosity has many forms and each carries its own depth, its own beauty. To understand why giving transforms us so profoundly, we must look closely at its levels, from the simplest to the highest. The first is material giving, tai thai. This is the kind of generosity most people recognize. Offering food to someone who is hungry, clothing to someone who is cold, money to support a cause, or shelter to those without a home. These acts may seem ordinary, but to the one receiving, they can mean survival, dignity, or even life itself. Material giving addresses immediate needs, and it reminds us that we are responsible for one another's well-being. But there is a second, deeper level, giving of protection, vo I thai. This is not about money or possessions. It is about offering safety, comfort, and courage to those who live in fear. Imagine rescuing an animal from harm, standing up for someone who is being bullied, or helping a friend through a storm of anxiety. In these moments, we give something priceless, peace of mind. To feel safe, to feel seen, to feel that someone stands beside you, this is a gift no amount of wealth can buy. And then there is the highest, most profound level, giving of truth, phop thai. This is the offering of wisdom, compassion, and insight. When we share the Dharma, when we teach what frees the mind from ignorance, when we guide others toward awakening, we give a gift that never fades. Food nourishes for a day. Protection comforts for a time. But truth transforms a life and perhaps many lives to come. That is why the Buddha declared the gift of Dharma as the supreme gift. Consider the ripple effect. A teacher shares the Dharma with one student. That student lives with more compassion, more clarity. Their family feels the change. Their community feels it. Perhaps generations are touched by a single seed of wisdom planted long ago. This is the power of truth as a gift. It multiplies endlessly, lighting candles across time. But even within these levels, there is another dimension, the heart with which we give. A handful of rice, offered with pure compassion, shines brighter than a mountain of gold given with pride. Generosity is not measured in the size of the gift, but in the sincerity of the heart. And here lies the subtle beauty of Buddhism. You don't need to be wealthy to give. You don't need power, position, or influence. Every one of us can practice generosity right now. We can give time to listen deeply, patience when others falter, forgiveness when someone has hurt us. We can give a smile, a kind word, or a silent prayer. The currency of giving is not always material. It is compassion, attention, and love. The Buddha himself demonstrated all three levels across lifetimes in countless ways. Stories tell of him offering his body to feed a starving tigress, protecting others from harm, and, above all, dedicating his entire existence to teaching the truth. Each level of giving reveals a heart less bound by self, more open to all beings. So ask yourself, where in your life can you give? Is it through resources, through protection, through wisdom? Perhaps it is a blend of all three. Each act is a step toward liberation, a loosening of the chains of attachment. And as we reflect on these levels of giving, we begin to see generosity is not a single act we do once in a while. It is a way of living, a way of being in the world. To give is to embody compassion itself. Throughout countless lifetimes, the Buddha walked this earth not as the enlightened one we revere today, but as a bodhisattva, one who vows to perfect compassion, wisdom, and generosity for the sake of all beings. And in those lifetimes, he left behind stories, known as the Jataka tales, that continue to inspire hearts across centuries. Each story shines a light on the power of giving, not as a duty, but as a profound joy that transcends even life itself. One story tells of the hungry tigress. Long ago, the bodhisattva was born as a prince. One day he came upon a tigress and her cubs, starving, weak, on the edge of death. The mother's ribs pressed against her skin, her eyes hollow from hunger. The prince knew, without food, she would devour her own young. His heart trembled with compassion. He searched for something to give, but there was no food, no offering at hand. And then he understood the only gift left was his own body. Without hesitation, he laid himself before the tigress, offering his life to save hers and her cubs. To some, this may sound extreme, even unimaginable, but to the bodhisattva it was not sacrifice. It was joy, the deepest joy of all, to preserve life through selfless giving. That seed of compassion would one day blossom into the boundless love of the Buddha. Another tale speaks of the great monkey king. Born as a wise and powerful monkey, the bodhisattva led his tribe in a forest rich with fruit. One day, a human king desired the mangoes that grew there. He sent his men to capture the monkeys. The bodhisattva, seeing his people in danger, leapt into action. He stretched his body across a river, forming a living bridge so the other monkeys could escape. His body ached, his skin tore, yet he did not move until every last monkey was safe. His life was the price of their freedom. In his giving, he lost nothing, for his heart overflowed with joy. There is also the story of Prince Vesantara, perhaps the most famous of all. Vesantara was known for his unmatched generosity. No request was too great for him to fulfill. He gave away elephants, chariots, even his kingdom's treasures. And when asked, he gave away his own children, offering them into slavery, and even his beloved wife. To most, this seems unbearable, a story of loss beyond words. Yet in the spirit of the tale, Vesantara felt no sorrow. His heart was free from attachment, radiant with the joy of giving without limit. These stories are not told to glorify suffering or demand that we give up everything we love. They are told to awaken us to the extraordinary joy that lies in true generosity. A joy so profound that it transcends fear, transcends self, transcends the boundary between life and death. And though these stories come from lifetimes long past, their echoes still reach us today. Consider the modern hero who gives away wealth to build schools, the doctor who risks their life to save strangers in crisis, or even the ordinary neighbor who shares their last loaf of bread in times of need. The spirit of the bodhisattva lives on in every act of true generosity. What unites all these stories, ancient and modern, is one truth. Giving does not diminish us, it completes us. The bodhisattva did not see loss in giving his life or his treasures. He saw freedom, love, and the unshakable joy that arises when the self dissolves into compassion. And as we reflect on these stories, a question lingers in our hearts. If such immense joy is possible through great acts of generosity, what joy might we discover in even the smallest acts, here and now? Giving is beautiful. It heals the heart, uplifts the spirit, and connects us to one another. But even generosity has a shadow, a hidden trap that can quietly poison the act itself. That trap is the ego, the desire to be seen, to be praised, to be admired for our giving. Imagine someone who donates a large sum of money but makes sure their name is carved in stone, displayed for all to see. Or the person who helps another but secretly waits for recognition, applause, or a favor in return. Outwardly, it may look like generosity, but inwardly it is still rooted in me, mine, my. Instead of dissolving the ego, the act of giving has only fed it. The Buddha understood this danger well. He taught that the purity of generosity is not measured by the size of the gift, but by the freedom of the heart that offers it. When giving is tied to pride or expectation, it creates new chains instead of breaking old ones. It may bring a brief satisfaction, but not the deep, liberating joy that true generosity brings. Think of it this way. Giving with ego is like pouring water into a cup full of holes. No matter how much you pour, it never stays. But giving with selflessness is like watering a seed in rich soil. Even a single drop nurtures life that will continue to grow. There is a story of two men who offered alms to a monk. The first man gave a gold coin, but in his heart, he thought, "May others see my generosity. May they speak of me as a wealthy and noble giver." The second man gave only a single piece of bread, but with sincerity, thinking, "May this nourish the monk on his path. May he walk freely for the good of all beings." The Buddha later said, the bread carried more merit than the gold. Why? Because one was given with ego, the other with compassion. This truth is not confined to ancient stories. Even today, we see acts of giving paraded on social media, turned into performances for likes and validation. The act may help someone in need, yes, but the giver remains entangled, still chasing recognition. True joy remains out of reach. Pure generosity asks for nothing in return, not even gratitude. It is like a tree that offers shade without asking who sits beneath it, or a river that quenches thirst without keeping count of how many drink. The sun shines, not because it seeks applause, but because shining is its nature. In the same way, true giving flows naturally from a heart that has discovered freedom from self. This doesn't mean we should condemn ourselves when pride arises. Ego is subtle, and it often creeps in unnoticed. Instead, we can use these moments as reminders to return to sincerity. Before we give, we can pause and ask, am I giving to be seen, or am I giving to serve? Am I seeking recognition, or am I seeking to open my heart? The Buddha taught that the highest joy of giving comes when we give in silence, without attachment to outcome, without expectation of return. When we give this way, the act itself is complete, whole, and perfect. No applause is needed, no witness required. The joy is already there, blooming in the quiet of our own heart. So the question remains, will we allow the ego to turn giving into another form of taking, or will we let generosity be what it truly is? A path of freedom, a dissolving of the self, a glimpse into the boundless joy of compassion. A single drop of water falls into a still pond. At first, it seems small, almost insignificant, but watch closely. The ripples spread outward, touching every corner of the water's surface. Generosity works in the very same way. One act, however small, carries a power far greater than the eye can see. Think of the time someone offered you kindness when you least expected it. A warm meal, a gentle word, a hand extended in silence. That moment did more than meet your immediate need. It planted a seed inside you, and often that seed blossoms into another act of kindness passed forward to someone else. The Buddha understood this chain reaction well. He taught that a heart touched by generosity naturally wants to give. It is like lighting a candle from another candle. The flame does not diminish, yet the light multiplies. One gift, one act, One gesture can ignite countless others, moving from person to person, generation to generation. History is full of such ripples. A teacher shares wisdom with a single student, and that student goes on to guide thousands. A stranger helps a weary traveler who later helps another in need, who then raises a child to be compassionate. None of them may ever meet, yet they are connected by invisible threads of giving. In Buddhism, this ripple effect is not just poetic, it is karmic. Every act of generosity creates conditions that extend far beyond what we can imagine. A meal given to a hungry monk allows him to continue his meditation. That meditation blossoms into wisdom. That wisdom reaches others, bringing peace and clarity. And the original giver, though far removed, remains a part of that chain of awakening. But here's the beauty. The ripple doesn't stop with others. It returns to us as well. When we give, we feel lighter, freer, more connected. That joy inspires us to give again and again. And with each act, the ripples grow stronger, weaving us into a larger ocean of compassion. Imagine a world where more of us embrace this. A neighbor helps a struggling mother. That mother finds the strength to comfort her child. The child grows with a heart softened by kindness, and one day offers comfort to a stranger. What began as one small act has now changed the course of lives. This is why the Buddha often emphasized that even the simplest act, a smile, a word of encouragement, a single grain of rice offered with sincerity, holds immeasurable power. It is not the size of the gift, but the sincerity of the heart that sets the ripples in motion. When you give, you are not only helping in the moment, you are creating a wave, a current of compassion that moves far beyond your sight. The person you help may never speak your name, and the people touched by them may never know you existed. Yet the chain continues, silent and unstoppable. So perhaps the real question is this: what kind of ripples do we want to leave behind? Do we want to scatter waves of self-centeredness, or do we want to set into motion a tide of kindness that carries forward long after we are gone? One drop, one act, one choice. That is all it takes to begin a ripple that can touch the world. When we hear the word generosity, the mind often imagines grand gestures, donating fortunes, building temples, sacrificing everything. But true giving is not limited to the extraordinary. In fact, the most transformative form of generosity is often woven quietly into the fabric of our daily lives. Consider the smile you offer to a weary cashier at the grocery store, the patience you extend when someone cuts you off in traffic, the time you give to truly listen when a friend needs to be heard. These moments may appear small, but in the heart, they carry the same spirit of boundless generosity that the Buddha taught. The Buddha once said that even offering a single cup of water, given with sincerity, creates immeasurable merit. Why? Because generosity is not about the size of the gift, it is about the quality of the heart that gives it. A kind glance, a gentle word, an act of forgiveness. These are gifts as real and as healing as food or shelter. Think about your daily routine. Every morning you have countless chances to give. You can give your attention fully to your child when they speak, instead of rushing past. You can give respect to a coworker by acknowledging their effort. You can give compassion to yourself by letting go of harsh self-criticism. Each of these is an offering, a small act that lightens the weight of the world. And what's beautiful is that generosity does not always require wealth or abundance. Some of the poorest in material terms have the richest hearts. A villager who shares a piece of bread with a traveler may have given more deeply than a wealthy man who donates a fortune for recognition. What matters is not the hand, but the intention behind it. But giving in everyday life also requires awareness. Too often, we overlook opportunities because we are absorbed in our own concerns. The practice is to slow down to notice. Notice the person who seems lost and in need of directions. Notice the colleague who looks burdened and could use encouragement. Notice the stray animal in need of care. Life constantly invites us to give, if only we are awake enough to see it. There is also the giving of presents. In an age where attention is constantly scattered, to offer your full, undistracted presence is one of the rarest and most valuable gifts. Sitting with a loved one, phone put aside, heart fully open, that is generosity in its purest form. The Buddha taught that giving transforms the giver as much as the receiver. When we give in everyday life, something shifts inside us. The heart softens, the mind grows lighter, the ego loosens its grip. Slowly, we realize that joy is not found in how much we keep, but in how freely we share. And so, generosity need not be reserved for temples, charities, or special occasions. It belongs in the kitchen, the office, the streets, the smallest exchanges of daily living. For when we bring generosity into ordinary moments, life itself becomes extraordinary. So perhaps the question is not whether we can give, but how often we are willing to see the opportunities right in front of us. At the heart of human struggle lies a simple truth: we cling to ourselves. We measure life through my needs, my wants, my pain, my gain. This narrowing of the heart is what Buddhism calls selfishness, and it is the root of much of our suffering. The tighter we hold, the heavier life feels. But generosity opens a door. Each act of giving, no matter how small, loosens the chains of the self. We begin to see that our happiness is not separate from others, that joy is not a possession but a shared experience. In this way, giving becomes a bridge from the prison of selfishness to the vast freedom of compassion. Think of a candle flame. When it burns alone, it only lights a small space. But when it shares its fire, it can ignite countless other candles without losing its own brilliance. Compassion works in the same way. The moment we step beyond ourselves, our capacity to love becomes limitless. The Buddha himself was the living embodiment of this transformation. Again and again in his past lives, he gave, sometimes his wealth, sometimes his comfort, sometimes even his life, not because he sought reward, but because compassion had become his very nature. His teachings remind us that this boundless compassion is not reserved for saints. It is within each of us, waiting to be awakened. Selfishness whispers, "If I give, I will have less." But compassion reveals, when I give, I become more open, more free, more connected to the fabric of life. Each act of generosity chips away at the walls of ego until the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve. And when those boundaries soften, something miraculous happens. We start to feel the suffering of others as our own. The hunger of a stranger stirs our heart. The tears of a child move us to act. The loneliness of an elder calls forth our presence. This is the essence of boundless compassion. Not pity, not obligation, but a deep recognition that their well-being and ours are inseparable. From this place, giving is no longer a duty. It is joy. It is natural, like a river flowing to the sea, like the sun rising each morning. There is no calculation, no hesitation. The heart simply responds because compassion has become its nature. And here lies the true promise of generosity. It transforms us. It takes us from the narrow confines of me and mine into the limitless expanse of we and ours. It carries us from isolation into connection, from fear into trust, from selfishness into love. So the journey is clear. Each act of giving is a step away from the prison of self and a step toward the freedom of compassion. And the more we walk this path, the lighter we become, until compassion is no longer something we practice. It is simply who we are. All along this journey, we have uncovered a timeless truth. Happiness does not come from clinging, but from letting go, not from taking, but from giving. From the illusion of chasing possessions to the healing power of generosity, to the boundless compassion that blossoms when the self dissolves, every step has pointed to the same horizon. That horizon is freedom, and the path is giving. The Buddha often taught that the joy of giving is unlike any other joy. It is not fleeting, like pleasure born from possession. It does not wither like praise or recognition. It is eternal because it springs from the very nature of the awakened heart. A heart that has tasted this joy does not return to the narrow walls of selfishness. It flows outward endlessly, like a river that finds its way to the ocean. Generosity is not about how much we own or how much we give away. It is about who we become when we give. Every smile, every act of kindness, every offering of patience or compassion transforms us, softens us, expands us. Slowly, we discover that the greatest gift of all is not what we place in another's hand, but the freedom and joy that bloom within our own heart. And this is the secret. When you give, you are not losing anything. You are awakening to your true nature. You are remembering that life is not a possession to be hoarded, but a current to be shared. So, as we step away from these reflections, let us not wait for the perfect moment or the grand opportunity. Let us begin where we are with what we have right now. A kind word, a helping hand, a moment of attention, all these are sparks of eternal joy. Because in the end, true wealth is not measured by what we keep, but by what we give away. And true joy, the kind that does not fade, the kind that carries us beyond ourselves, is found only in the open hand and the open heart. So let your life ripple outward. Let your giving become a song that others carry forward. And may your heart taste the eternal joy that comes only from generosity. If these words have touched your heart, let them stay with you, not as ideas to remember, but as seeds to live. And if this journey has brought you a sense of peace or clarity, I invite you to continue walking with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we share timeless teachings, reflections, and stories that nurture the spirit and guide the heart. Together, we can keep these ripples of compassion moving outward, reaching more souls in need of light. May your days be filled with kindness, your heart with freedom, and your life with the joy that only comes from giving.